Hello there, fellow zombie slayers. My name is Stanley557. I love covering every unique aspect of the Call of Duty Zombie series. But did you know that there were Call of Duty Zombie comics? That's right! From games, to animation, to even comics, this franchise has always been trying unique ways to share its story. Featuring two distinct runs between 2016 to 2017 and 2018 to 2019, these comic runs cover two specific periods in the franchise's history. The first follows the Victus crew from transit in an interweaving narrative that ties together many of the original Aether storyline's disconnected threads, and the second is a prequel novel to the Chaos storyline that better fleshes out the world and shows the exploits of Scarlet's father, Alistair Rhodes. Both sets of comics are amazing, but before we even get into that, if you want to read the comics for yourselves, you can check them out below. Just make sure that you run an ad blocker. So sit back and relax as we discuss them, and I get to share with you what all the hype is about. Aptly titled Call of Duty Zombies and Call of Duty Zombies 2, these comics were a writing collaboration between Justin Jordan, Jason Blundell, and Craig Houston. It's impossible to tell who wrote what, but assuming by Jason and Craig's limited schedules, it's best presumed the duo wrote the general outline and provided overview, while it's up to Justin Jordan to fill in the rest, and he does a great job given the source material. For Volume 1, the books were illustrated and colored by Jonathan Wayshak and Dan Jackson respectively. Each cover was done by Simon Bisley, and finally letters were done by Michael Heisler. For Volume 2, the books were illustrated, inked, and colored by Andres Ponce, Moreau Vargas, and Dan Jackson respectively. The cover art for these comics were created by E.M. Gist, and letters were done by Nate Picos. Now, I'm unfamiliar with the comic space and what each of these men are notable for, and also I really hope I said all of their names right. I want to give props to each of these men and their respective roles in the comics before moving forward. Very rarely do we get to put faces to the names, especially all of the names on a Zombies project. So I really want to give them some flowers here. That you all did a great job. The artwork in these comics, especially the first one, is wacky, caricatured, and outright fantastic. Everyone is given wildly fun proportions, and it feels like that they never had to compromise on their vision, which is something that the franchise has had to deal with as early as the day it was created. Like, a limitation of the games is making everyone the same size, as it'd be unfair if certain characters had advantages based on their model size. Although that is 100% something that they should look into in the next game. But in the comics, that restriction is completely removed, so the Victus crew feel like an actual gang of ragtag goobers. Marlton's beard stubble is drawn better than ever, Stuhlinger is always portrayed as a meek weasel, Misty is given all the confidence that she rightfully earns, and Russman is this large glob that always changes size based on panel and perspective. Then there's the constantly caricatured facial reactions. Stuhlinger easily becomes the star of the show in this category, and the artists take a lot of creative liberties with his appropriately distressed reactions. And in general, these are some gorgeous comic books, with Volume 1 being more zany and Volume 2 better reflecting the 1910 period piece that is trying to replicate. So once more, props to each of you and your hard work and dedication. It brings so much life to this series. So with that out of the way, let's get into the actual content, starting with Volume 1. Now, unlike my normal reviews, this is not going to be a panel-by-panel breakdown of each comic. Instead, a simple overview of the plot and elements I thought were cool and worked. I do want people to actually go out there and read these things. They're really cool. Volume 1 is a simple recap, and the reintroduction of the characters of the Victus crew, comprised of Abigail Misty Briarton, Marlton Johnson, Russman, and Samuel Stuhlinger, the man who can hear Edward Richthofen in his head. With Comic 1, it's quickly established that it is now Primus Richthofen who resides in there, not Ultimus. And together, the group have managed to survive on this broken Earth following the events of Moon, Transit, Die Rise, and Buried. Taking the Maxis ending as the canonical approach, the universe will soon be destroyed by Ludwig Maxis after Victus helped him ascend to Agartha, damning the world and sending Edward's soul into that of a zombie. The story picks up seemingly after those events, with Victus bunkering down in a nearby city, which is weird because they were last in Africa, but hey, what do I know? It seems that the group split at one point and are now being brought back together due to a rapid rise in undead coordination, with the group being led by an undead Richthofen whose origins will soon be explained. Some interesting notes are that the undead are being distracted by drones and bright lights, zombie Richthofen having some sort of control over the undead, and the undead willingly following a leader, which is a concept that we wouldn't see again until Cold War with the hierarchy of the Dark Ether and Zykov. My favorite page is easily page 21, which perfectly illustrates the adventure our crew are on and the arcs that they're going to go through. Then there's the ciphers. Hidden, or not hidden, in each of the 6 comics are 3 ciphers per issue that can be solved, which give us plenty, and by plenty I mean almost none, hints regarding Black Ops 4 and the story going forward. The ciphers are as follows. Primus will fail, its knowledge is a curse, and the keepers shall rise once more. The first 2 are pretty obvious. Premise will fail either details the events of the Great War, where in order to break the cycle, Richtofen must abandon the Great War, or the notion that Premise fails in the broken cycle and it's up to someone else to defeat Monty and the Shadow Man. This is illustrated in the famous Revelation cipher, but knowing the ending of Tog, it never actually comes up. Its knowledge as a curse refers to the Chronorium, but it's the third cipher that confuses me most of all. The Keepers shall rise once more doesn't seem to make much sense in our current context, because the Keepers never fell in the first place. And finally, there's the last page. Each Volume 1 comic features a revamped loading screen from eras past. Each one is meant to provide us with additional context for previous events and recontextualize our understanding, or retconning, so they better fit into the narrative going forward into Black Ops 4. The first one is a one-to-one rendition of Nuketown's loading screen, with everything simply pulled back a bit to provide new context. Originally, we had no idea what any of these panels meant, but now we have a better understanding of everything, including further context provided by Classified. Apparently, this infamously mysterious device is a 115 drill. This massive unseen in-game machine was used at Camp Edward to mine 115 out of the Earth. This 115 would go on to be used in 5, Classified, Nuketown, and Alpha Omega, and would be pivotal in aiding Americans in creating teleporters, the Winter's Howl, Camp Edward, all the robots there, the APD, and the Groom Lake moon-based teleporter. The scientist also seen in the right panel is now recontextualized as Dr. Schuster, the man who personally worked with Richtofen on teleportation projects, and explains why his work is seen in 5 and Classified. Issue 2 immediately begins in a much more interesting locale, where Richtofen takes the Victus crew to a Broken Arrow facility, something only ever alluded to in Die Rise and Buried, and hardly explored. This comic is all about Russman, his previous line of work as an agent for Broken Arrow, the existence of the second half of the Elemental Shard, and the Bios, which are 115-infused animal hybrids. It's later confirmed in Alpha Omega that this facility takes place in China, and is most likely where the jumping jacks originated. The comic constantly cuts back in time and splices together the story of the Victus crew and the fall of this Broken Arrow facility. The building was specifically shuttered to keep the bios locked away, which reanimate as long as the Elemental Shard is still being powered. The rest of the comic is more or less this brawl, and it's a sight to behold. It appears the time spent here also begins to jog Russman's memory, and these events are even brought back up again in Togger Toten. Once the Elemental Shard is retrieved, the bios are defeated and the endless undead begin their assault all over again. Elements of note are the further explanation of Broken Arrow before Black Ops 4, Russman's hand in all of this, further cooperation between the undead, and of course, more Ultimus Richtofen, who I swear is always aura farming of some kind. My favorite page has to be page 20, and it gives Russman plenty of star moments, something we never would have gotten from him in Black Ops 2. And speaking of these moments, I want to applaud the comic for taking its characters seriously, while still having them get up into sci-fi inspired hijinks. Justin Jordan understands how these characters can be sympathetic, badass, unlikable, and unagreeable, yet still make them someone that the audience can root for, even without any of the previous background or nostalgia that they're tied to. Then there are the ciphers. Shadows are gathering, a great evil will be unleashed, events long foretold will soon come to pass, and beware those who use the truth only to deceive. Ciphers 1 and 3 seem to be talking about Dr. Monty and his eventual reveal as the true threat, and the second one seems to be foretelling the events of the broken cycle, but make of those what you will. And finally, the redone loading screen here is the Ascension loading screen. Now taking place in Dreisendrach, the panel depicts Samantha's time there, the Keeper traveling to the moon to recover the MPD, and Monty designing the summoning key schematic found in Shadows of Evil. Most of it is incredibly unclear, but if you have a good theory, let me know. The third comic follows the Victus crew arriving at a Zero base facility, an installation apparently built by Maxis that takes beings to Zero Earth. The crew begin to question how intentional it is for the undead to be following them before they are interrupted by a Sophia AI. The rest of the comic is Marlton and the AI battling one another before Marlton finally gains the upper hand and dismantles it, finding the teleporter needed to access Zero Earth. With the Elemental Shard in hand, they can now arrive at what is seemingly a fixed world. This issue gives Marlton plenty of moments to shine, and highlights his strength while utilizing the rule of cool in areas he would be seemingly defeated in. A far cry from the man who yells, "beat them off" when referring to the undead. Another interesting note are the relics at Zero base. Just to name a few, you can see an unpowered lightning staff, an empty Vril device, the moon egg, and Ted. My favorite page has to be page 16. The colors are really well done, and Marlton looks really cool. The ciphers include "wisdom means little to the unwise," "these are many histories, many futures, only one can prevail," and "many souls have been lost forever, many more are at risk." Each cipher seems to be from the Chronorium, with Cipher 2 detailing the eventual breaking of the cycle, The third seems to be from Nikolai's point of view in the Alpha Omega intro cinematic, and the first is unclear, and feels way too vague to be important unless it's simply a jab at the Victus crew who could never understand the Chronorium, even if they tried to read its contents. The third loading screen takes Nox Black Ops 1 comic and recontextualizes it in the theme of Blood of the Dead. But not every panel is perfect, but the main gist shows us Brutus, his prisoners, the prison itself, and Primus arriving on time, as they usually do. The only sore thumb here are the cryopods used by Ultimus. Maybe these could be alluding to the cryopods that Victus used, but those have a completely different design. Maybe it's meant to highlight Pablo's importance later down the line, but I have no idea. Seems like a weird detail, especially considering we know what the Victus cryopods look like later in the comics, and Ultimus's cryopods are never seen on Blood of the Dead. But this was a super unique pick, and I'm glad they used it. The fourth comic follows Stuhlinger, and finally we get to see his direct interactions with Primus Richthofen. Once they arrive at Zero Base, the undead leave them alone, giving the group time to rest while Stuhlinger goes off to speak on his own with Richthofen. While doing so, he discovers that all life here is collapsing due to human intervention, or something. Which is weird considering how did Maxis build this base without human intervention, but what do I know. Stuhlinger attempts to retrieve the Chronorium by himself, but Richthofen instructs him he needs the others. He can't go at it alone. In trying to do so, a fight breaks out with Stuhlinger antagonizing Misty, and instinctively reaching for his pistol, which leads to Marlton pointing a gun at Stuhlinger, which leads to Brustman pointing a gun at Marlton, and finally Misty tries to de-escalate them all. It's a great scene that wonderfully illustrates how dysfunctional the group is in a realistic way, that highlights each of their worst qualities in the best way possible. My favorite panel is Stuhlinger letting go of the weapon and the realization of what he's done. Fantastic character writing for someone who is usually only given lines where he talks about piss. In the ensuing chaos, the undead return and Stuhlinger rushes off to retrieve the Chronorium, unknowingly releasing robot-human hybrids created to defend the book should anyone come after them. Which again, how are there human zombies here if their existence causes everything to start unraveling, but what do I know? The fight is again the best part of the issue, and I love how the stakes are escalated in a way that you just can't do in a normal zombies map. It feels like the perfect combination which takes advantage of both the medium that they're in and the characters that they choose to revolve it around. Ultimus Richthofen gets some more time to shine, and I love the way that Brustman predicts the robots before they actually awaken. My favorite page has to be page 20, and the way that the undead leads Stuhlinger exactly where he needs to go, especially considering his connections to the flesh, simply pushing him in the direction that is needed. The ciphers include "The innocent must be protected," "On the final day, the soulless ones will be erased, and only their sacrifice will restore order." Cipher 1 references the children in the house, Cipher 2 references how only Eddie and Sam get to live on in the perfect world following Tog, and Cipher 3 illustrates that death is the only answer, and references our characters' deaths at the hands of Nikolai in Tog der Toten. And then there's the comic panel, which is a rendition of Kino's loading screen, which further explains how the events of the Giant recontextualize Noct, Varuk, Shinonuma, and Darius in the Broken Cycle. It also explains how the fractures work in the Giant, DE, Setsubo, and Gorod. Easily one of my favorites. For those who don't know, the primary purpose of the Giant wasn't to collect Richthofen's innocent soul like the other three. That was already accomplished long before the map chronologically in Dimension 2210. This is even questioned by Dempsey. Instead, the main purpose of this event was to create anomalies in the multiverse that could only exist due to Ultimus Richthofen no longer being alive. Thus, the remaining Ultimus members are never brainwashed, creating Dreisendrach, Setsubo, and Gorod Krovi. The fifth comic follows Misty and the fallout of the group's fight, their subsequent escape, and their reunion as a group, and finally, extraction of the Chronorium. A pretty simple issue, all things considered. I love the way the chapter mixes and matches the characters, and best shows their individuality and their inability to cooperate in these specific circumstances. Only as a team on the same page can things be accomplished, and safely, and correctly. And it's exactly what Primus and Ultimus Richthofen are counting on due to the group being made up of a bunch of buffoons who need corralling. My favorite pages have to be 15 and 16 as they solidify why this group works when they're all on the same page. I think the only thing that doesn't work about the issue are the robot hybrids. They don't have a name, a backstory, or even really that good of a design if you ask me. They feel like carbon copies of the bios, just simply given metal armor and called robots, and they're not animals. Okay, so they're not really like the bios, but they're just like another enemy for the Victus crew to face, and they're just not really unique at all. They're really just kind of there. This time, instead of defending the elemental shard, the robots just defend the Chronorium. They're never explained again past this point, and might as well not even been included. Then there are the ciphers, which include "The voices of darkness and light will call out across space and time," The man-fool seeks redemption, he will not find it, and the agents of chaos must be controlled. Cypher 1 is clearly referencing the duality needing to be resolved by the Apothicons and the Keepers in Togder Toten. Cypher 2 is referencing maybe Stuhlinger, I'm not entirely sure. And the third cipher, I also can't tell you, unless the forces of chaos are referring to both the Keepers and the Apothicons. Honestly, the master gambit in this scenario would just be them referencing chaos long before it was even a thing. And finally, there's the comic book, which is a redo of the Dire Eyes loading screen. Again, I really like these picks for these. They're going with so many obscure ones, like not the most generic ones that you would think of whenever you think of these. The comic itself details most of Primus and Ultimus Richtofen confronting Monty at the house. Sadly, this is one of the few we never got an answer to the point where it is both referenced in Alpha Omega's intro cutscene and Togder Toten's outro, and erased as the multiverse collapses, seemingly signifying that this is a plot thread we'll never get a conclusion on. The best theory I've heard is that this is the moment and timeline where Monty admits that the multiverse persisting is Primus's fault, something explained to us in the TOG outro but never seen in game, and most likely happens here. And finally, Comic 6 is the grand finale, and it's where everything comes to a head. The first half of the comic details their escape from the Zero Base facility, their understanding not to kill Ultimus Richtofen, and Ultimus Richtofen retrieving the blood samples from the teleportation device. This detail is in fact referenced all the way back with Goroi Crofi's ciphers, so it's really cool to see it finally answered and shown. The second half of the issue, while confusing, is one of my favorites. Having been a fan for so many years, there were plenty of questions and concerns how all of these disconnected threads would be tied together, especially between Primus and Victus of all groups. But here it is, Misty directly questioning Primus Richtofen, and I love how the group reacts to him in his crazy antics. Now, the last 10 pages cover a lot of ground in such a short amount of time, so bear with me. Some events include Primus Richtofen reading the Chronorium for the first time, the collection of the blood vials officially, Richtofen's quickly diminishing sanity, Ultimus Richtofen's zombies' last moments before classified in Alpha Omega, Richtofen retrieving the blood vials from Alcatraz, Primus Richtofen retrieving the blood vials from himself before the events of Origins, Victus hopping into cryopods, which eventually leads to Blood of the Dead and Togder Toten as an insurance policy for the Broken Cycle, and finally, Primus arriving on time at the prison after the events of Zetsuba no Shima to retrieve the blood vials for Dempsey, Takio, and Nikolai. And thus concludes Volume 1. What a mouthful. These comics cover such a wide period for the franchise, and if you're like me, pretty much everything falls into place pretty well, but it requires years of extensive knowledge, so I hope I explain things in a way that makes sense. My favorite page has to be page 14, which perfectly illustrates the monumental occasion, cause if you're anything like me, you know this is a really, really big deal for Victus to be meeting someone like Primus Richtofen. The comic does a good job at wrapping things up, and even confronting Richtofen and how he ran them all around purposely. The final ciphers include The Great Deceiver will make himself known, His lies will doom you all, and the cycle begins. Cipher 1 references Monty's reveal, Cipher 2 references again either Monty or Primus Richtofen, and Cipher 3 basically puts in the timeline where this comic chronologically happens, and explains to us that this happens at the beginning of the cycle after Origins. Now having the Chronorium, Richtofen can retrieve the summoning key and make his way to the Giant where BO3 starts. Overall, the ciphers in the comic were confusing, annoying, and didn't exactly tell us a whole lot what we already didn't know, and the stuff it did tell us is confusing and lacks substance. But I guess that's the nature of these things. And for the final loading screen, we have the Mob of the Dead one being redone to represent events that will soon happen in Blood of the Dead. The left half of the page is left intact, but it's the right half to receive some major differences. It shows Richtofen meeting with Stanley Ferguson to have the lab constructed underneath the prison in the pocket dimension, the blood vials he just received, Richtofen seemingly leaving the places unknown, and once again, those damn Ultimus cryopods. This one has to be referencing Pablo in some way, shape, or form, right? And that's the loading screen redos. An incredible concept and one I wish that they had went with in the actual maps. Like here, this one's perfect for Blood of the Dead. Put it in the map. But that's Call of Duty Zombies Volume 1, a fantastic comic line that doesn't hold back, and is meant to be a supplemental piece to the entire overarching narrative of the original Aether storyline, but it does explain many disconnected threads while still having the time to be charming, well-designed, and brilliantly written. These comic books actually give their main characters a chance to breathe between all of the insanity, and the medium works perfectly to express the highs and lows of combat that zombies could simply never have in its original form. I love how each member of the crew has their own dedicated story, and it's something that Black Ops 6 could have learned from in its approach to storytelling. I love the locations that the book picks for its main locales, and the ones it creates are just as wacky and nonsensical as the ones in previous iterations. Then there are the undead, which are used brilliantly as this never-ending force, and making Richtofen their leader feels like perfect irony. I would highly recommend that you all go out there and read it if you can. But now, let's shift gears and talk about Volume 2. Call of Duty Zombies Volume 2 is a prequel comic that follows Alistair Rhodes in a few of his exploits, specifically where he meets Bruno Delacroix, Stanton Shaw, and Diego Nicali, and the misadventures of Scarlet Rhodes. Unlike Volume 1, this story is a bit more crucial to the understanding of chaos, with Issue 4 explaining things not expressed in the map that is supposed to be taking place nearby. Also, unlike Volume 1, the artwork is a lot more grounded, better reflecting the tone of chaos and its Indiana Jones and Westerns inspirations. I also love the blocking of these comics. They get really creative with how they convey movement, and hopefully you'll get to see it in here too. Issue 1 follows a quick pre-word by Scarlet, setting up the overarching narrative, and then jumps right into the first story with Bruno and Alistair in Morocco. The tale has Alistair recruit the large Frenchman to retrieve the Scepter of Ra, and together the duo accomplishes by stealing the device from Bruno's former employers. I love the way the issue bounces between French translated English and just normal English, and it pulls off this maneuver through clever writing devices. Bruno is an incredibly haunted figure, and in this issue we get to see the incident of the child he accidentally murdered, which is something only ever referenced in the maps with little context. This event has haunted Bruno and caused him to run away to the French Legion out of fear of who he really is deep inside, a monster. This is the theme toyed with in the main maps and is explored perfectly here. Bruno's fears appear to resonate with Alistair and he recruits him, especially considering he'd appreciate the muscle. This issue is a lot of fun, but in its quieter moments has a bit too much exposition for my liking, and characters tell a bit more than they show, and I feel some trimming of the script would have worked wonders. I love Bruno's brutality, and the way the art tries to show this in each panel is pristine. Also revealed in the comic is Bruno's revival at the hands of the Scepter of Ra, an event that would have drastic ramifications in the Chaos maps. And finally, there's my favorite page, which is easily page 20, and clearly the money shot of the entire issue. Then to end the comic, we have a page that shows the Order attempting to follow them, with the High Priest still being alive, something we never actually saw in Black Ops 4 as his fate past 9 was unknown and only alluded to us in Ancient Evil. Issue 2 follows Stanton Shaw having accidentally killed 147 men experimenting with a gas-based weapon for World War I. Shaw is taken away by German authorities shortly before he can aid Alistair on his quest in Cambodia. Seeking to bargain with the men, Alistair agrees to help them find a new weapon to win great battles should they keep Shaw alive. The men agree and arrive at a Cambodian temple, where they are eventually consumed by prima materia. Now zombified, Shaw and Alistair escape with their lives, with Shaw using his unstable chemistry to save the day. This issue is a particular note due to it showing how prima materia works outside of a trial, to extremely similar and deadly effects. Almost instantaneously, the men are consumed, but unlike a trial, the men are damned to prima materia's clutches forever. Once again, this issue excels at the mystery of prima materia and the world of chaos. I think my biggest problem with the issue is that it's over right when it feels like it is just getting started. This was remedied by Volume 1 being one complete story, whereas Volume 2 has each issue having a beginning, middle, and end. My favorite page has to be pages 12, 13, and 14. I especially love Shaw's reaction to the whole thing, and it invokes some incredible Indiana Jones imagery as the men are consumed by powers beyond their understanding. And also, even if it's unintended, a really cool callback to the origins of zombies, as Germans, just like in Indiana Jones, are messing with forces that they don't understand, which is exactly how we get the original zombie storyline. In Issue 1, Bruno is painfully told how he was set up to kill a child, but in Issue 2, it does a great job at characterizing Shaw in just 2 pages. The issue also benefits from exposition that better wraps into the storytelling. In Issue 1, Bruno is painfully told how he was set up to kill a child, but in Issue 2, it does a better job at wrapping the smaller details into background elements. Like, in the background you can see Shaw making his concoction he uses at the end. Honestly, way better than you think it would be. Issue 3 follows Diego Nicali and his unique encounter with Alistair Rhodes. Apparently, Diego and his family have been holding on to the Odin Artifact's key for many years as a family heirloom. And the comic follows Diego, Alistair, and the Order as the 3 groups seem to fight over it. Eventually, Diego teams up with Alistair, and the two escape their haunting foes. Throughout the entire ordeal, it is the Order who claim to know what's best for the world, and facing off against them is also the High Priest of Chaos of all people. Although, he doesn't seem to brand the scarring seen at the end of 9, so it's possible that he had these effects reversed, or it's a different High Priest of Chaos, but I think that is unlikely. The man has an unnatural strength, and it makes me wonder if the effects of the trial during 9 actually enhanced him. Once they've escaped, the two part ways, but not before Diego loans Alistair the Odin key and wishes to see it return. I do have a small complaint though. During their first tussle, the High Priest manages to steal the Odin artifact key, and while escaping, it is only the High Priest who manages to catch up to them, allowing Diego to steal back the key before stopping him once and for all. But what's really funny to me is that if the High Priest didn't follow them, then they'd simply have full possession of the Odin key. Like, why didn't he hand it to one of his subordinates? Like, I get he wanted to capture Alistair too, that's fine, whatever, but he willingly allows the key to be stolen back by simply keeping it on his person. Another interesting fact about the comic is that Alistair's unwillingness to kill, which is an interesting trait about him you wouldn't assume. I don't think this is the flashiest comic, but my favorite page has to be page 13. I just find Alistair begging for his life like an old man more humorous because he instantly pulls a gun on them the moment he can. He truly is no different than Diego. Issue 3 has its problems, but I can't deny it's nice to get some more Diego Nicali action, and does a good job at establishing the Order's, albeit confusing goals, and better sets them up before the events of Ancient Evil, where they're seemingly working with Alistair before they're all turned to stone. And finally, there's Issue 4. Following Scarlet, the first half of the comic bounces through time and explores much of her past and how she became the way that she is now. The other half of the comic follows her attempts to stop the Order before the events of Dead of the Night, and wraps up in a pretty similar conclusion to the map, with both the comic and the outro cutscene being integral to get the full story. Honestly, it's kind of a mess narrative-wise and story-wise. Both the comic and the map attempt to tell the same story, omitting certain details from each perspective. All Scarlet knows is that the guests were murdered by the Order in the comic, but what we know is that the guests were murdered by zombies in the Danu trial, and then by the Order. In Dead of the Night, the player understands Scarlet shows up too late to stop her father's kidnapping, but in the comic, it is shown that she attempts to stop it before the party even begins, but she is almost accosted by the Order and fights them off while the events of Dead of the Night's trial play out in the background. My only concern is that with these events, Scarlet battles the Order in the woods nearby, but as seen in Dead of the Night, the trial extends quite far, even into the nearby woods. If anything, she should have been affected by the trial too. And while I really like it, just like issue 6 for volume 1, this issue runs at a brisk-neck pace and feels like it rushes to the finish line due to the page limitations, with page 21 being a complete mess with how much dialogue it has to cover in such a short amount of time. Seriously, speech bubble on top of speech bubble on top of speech bubble, like guys, a little bit of room please. Also, a funny anecdote is that in the comic during the Dead of the Night portion, Scarlet is wearing her scarf, which she wears going forward from Voyage to Despair due to needing it to withstand a gas-based chemical reaction from Shaw. But in Dead of the Night's outro, she's not wearing it. And just like in Volume 1, I love the way the comic messes with the proportions on page 20. It's really cool getting to see everyone's different sizes and builds, and it's something that they're never able to experiment in the game. Then there's Alistair's letter to Scarlet, which I swear that damn mystery box will haunt me till the day I die. My favorite page in the comic has to actually be the comic's cover. Unlike the other ones, which can come off as a bit uncanny, the fourth comic cover illustrates Alistair taking Scarlet to the museum, the day he is arrested for trying to steal something from it, and the day Scarlet is estranged from Alistair, their final happy moment. I also love the colors and the way it gives off this dreamlike vibe. But that's Volume 2. Unlike Volume 1, I can understand why they didn't go forward with the comics from this point. Despite how cool they are, it's overall a messy process. Volume 1 suffers from needing to understand nearly 8 years of lore at that point to make sense of anything. The hints it gives towards the future don't make a lot of sense, and many of the payoffs are just as confusing as their respective setups in the grand scheme of things. And then there's Volume 2, which suffers because it provides some important and at times crucial context that isn't shown off in-game. But if I'm being honest, it isn't all that gripping if you're not already someone who isn't invested in the Chaos storyline. They do a good job at being good jumping off points, but I don't think that they're all that compelling. The games aren't exactly going to get you in the comics, and the comics aren't exactly going to get you into the games. Both mediums suffer from the same confusing way Blundell directs his story. And while Volume 1 has some fantastic character writing, Volume 2 suffers from some mediocre storytelling that feels too by the numbers and doesn't lean much into what makes zombies zombies in the first place. And unlike Volume 1 with Victus, Volume 2 has the unenviable task of setting up and introducing 5 new characters. Characters with good, but complicated setups. and without any of the legroom to make it work. For example, the entire Victus storyline is one continuous novel, so throughout it the characters are constantly grappling with one another and must learn to work as a team. This provides an easy understandable arc with sense of catharsis by the time the 5th issue rolls around. It gives them all the opportunity to be on the same page and pits them as a collective against Richthofen, while having distinct enough personalities to react to his antics. Chaos sets itself in a grounded world, and none of them face any distinctive elements that separate them from their in-game counterparts. It also doesn't help that they're all bouncing off Alistair, a character who's not even in Black Ops 4, so by the time you start playing Black Ops 4, the one person that these people have all interacted with isn't in the game. And while yes, Volume 2 is technically told as one larger story, as they are described in Alistair's letter to Scarlet, it only benefits from that as a framing device, and each of the 4 tales are quite disconnected, which, as stated before, forces each one to have a fluent beginning, middle, and end, which takes up pages. Like, there is a through line, like in Bruno's with the Scepter of Ra, they use it to figure out where to find the Prima Materia in Cambodia. In Cambodia, they're able to see how it works and how the artifacts are all connected to that, and that leads them to the Odin Key. But I don't think it's a strong enough through line to really bring all these stories together. Volume 1 didn't have to contend with these issues, and they greatly benefited because of it. But despite my criticisms, I really cannot recommend both comics enough, and I had a blast spending hours analyzing and reading them. They both came with so much content for those willing to find it. But let me know what you thought in the comments if you read the comics. If you have, which one was your favorite? And if you haven't, well, what are you waiting for? Go read them! Thank you all so much for watching. If you like this video, why not try checking out some of my other reviews of Call of Duty Zombies? And if that's not your cup of tea, I have plenty of other content for you to dig and dive into. The comics were a super cool concept, and I'd love to see them explored again. But with all that said, thank you all so much for watching. And remember, keep on slaying.